There was an article that was carried March 27th by the New York Times news service, datelined San Francisco. The article reads, "By the power vested in him by this bastion of liberal politics, Mayor Willie Brown Jr. pronounced dozens of gay and lesbian couples virtual spouses on Monday in the first such mass mock nuptials held by a U.S. city. The domestic partnership ceremony for nearly 200 couples carried no legal weight because California law, like that of every other state, does not recognize marriages between homosexuals. But with the issue of same-sex unions creating increasing debate and legislative maneuvering across the country, the ceremony amounted to a splashy announcement, a splashy statement complete with a lesbian couple in matching white gowns. We're leading the way here in San Francisco for the rest of the state and the rest of the nation," Mr. Brown said. Well, sadly, he may very well be right in terms of leading the way for the rest of the state and the rest of the nation. Last Sabbath I read the verse in Isaiah chapter 3 and verse 9, speaking, it says, "The show of their countenance does witness against them, and they declare their sin as Sodom. They hide it not. Woe unto their souls, for they have rewarded evil unto themselves." They declare their sin as Sodom, they hide it not. And that is certainly the case. That is the reality of the world in which we live. Now, this aspect of the militant homosexual movement is merely one aspect of a concerted, all-out attack on the family. A concerted, all-out attack on the family unit. It didn't start with this mock marriage ceremony in San Francisco, but that simply is one aspect of showing how far we've come. Something like this would take place. Well, our society is in a state of flux. We see the fruits. You know, God said here in Isaiah 3:9, "Woe unto their souls, for they have rewarded evil unto themselves." There are consequences that we are beginning to pay increasingly as a nation. We have rewarded evil unto ourselves. You see it reflected in the rising rate of juvenile crime, violent crime. We're not talking, when we say juvenile crime, I'm not talking about 17 and 18-year-olds. Increasingly, we're talking about 11 and 12-year-olds. We're talking violent crime. We're talking rape. We're talking murder. You see the news from Baton Rouge yesterday. They arrested a 16-year-old high school student, Baton Rouge High School. He had attacked 9 girls, different times, not at school, but someone that they had walked the halls with, someone that they had sat in class with. 16-year-old boy attacked and raped girls there from that school. And they had finally caught up with him, or at least think they have the right one. That's just one example. The point is, we see over and over and over, we see consequences. We as a nation have rewarded evil unto ourselves because the problem didn't start with just some of these violent actions that have been perpetrated by young people. The problem went back further than that. The problem goes back to the very thing that God established as the means of shaping and training and teaching a generation. That is the family. Now, all the way down through time, there have been, the family is the bastion of of values. It's the means by which one generation transmits values to the next generation. That's why various social reformers who have had their own agenda have sought to undermine the family. When you go back to the Communist Revolution in 1917, one of the ideas that Lenin had in mind was the abolition of the family, that state daycare centers would raise the children, and this did not prove to be, after various attempts at it, finally backed off because it wasn't working. It wasn't something that he was able to fully implement. But it wasn't a new idea with him. It wasn't a new idea with Karl Marx. You can go back to Plato's Republic, written back over 400 years before Christ, and that was what he had advocated, and was actually to a degree tried in Sparta, one of the ancient Greek city-states. That was sort of the counterweight to Athens. Most of Greek politics and struggle seemed to be contests between Athens and Sparta for a period of a couple of centuries. And you find that Sparta was in many ways a prototype of what we would think of as a modern communist state. And Plato used Sparta as sort of a model in his Republic, and that was the inspiration for Karl Marx and for various others. The point is that they have viewed the idea of the family as something that had to be broken down and gotten away from, because they wanted to shape the next generation. And when you actually look around in American society today, you find that increasingly that is being done, not in maybe quite the open, blatant way that had been tried, but what you find is that so many of the American population have become so focused on their own convenience and on various things that they have willingly relinquished the training of their children to someone else. And we find that increasingly that is being viewed as a governmental role. Well, that's not the way that God established it at the beginning. God established the family. The family didn't originate simply with human ideas. It's not that one means of doing things is as good as another. The idea that Mayor Brown expressed in San Francisco, that we're leading the way for the rest of the state and the rest of the nation, well, they may very well be, but that's not what was intended from the beginning. It's important that we focus on the most important of human relationships and understand it more deeply. Understanding, to begin with, the origin of the family, the value and importance of the family, and understanding then what is involved in terms of how we need to inculcate it in our lives at this point in man's history. In Genesis chapter 2, verse 18, the Lord God said, "It is not good that the man should be alone. I will make him and help meet for him, exactly fitting and compatible. Somebody to fit in with him." Out of the ground, the Lord God had formed all the beasts of the field and the birds, and He had brought them to Adam to see what He would call them. Adam, we're told in verse 20, gave names to the cattle and to the birds and to the beasts of the field. But for Adam there was not found a help meet for him. There was nobody, there was nothing that was exactly suitable and compatible to Adam. And the eternal God caused a deep sleep to fall upon Adam, and he slept, and he took one of his ribs, and he closed up the flesh instead thereof. And the rib which the Lord God had taken from man, made he a woman, and he brought her to the man. And Adam said, "This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man." Woman is the plural form. In the Hebrew, the term for man is ish, and the word for woman is isha. It's just the feminine form of the same thing. So God created a masculine and a feminine form of human being. Therefore, verse 24, "Shall a man leave his father and his mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall become one flesh. Now, these words in verse 24 were not spoken by Adam. They were spoken by God, the one that actually became Jesus Christ. We read that back in Matthew chapter 19 when, you remember, the scribes and the Pharisees had come to Jesus tempting Him. They were trying to trip Him up and to get Him entangled in their arguments about divorce and remarriage. And He told them, have you not read that He which made them at the beginning made them male and female, and said, for this cause shall a man leave father and mother. These words were a part of the first wedding ceremony, if you will. Now, the wedding ceremony here was a little bit different than the one that Mayor Brown held in San Francisco. You know, when God said, it's not good that the man should be alone, I will make an help meet for him, He made Eve, not Steve. That may not, evidently there's some who haven't gotten the point on that in terms of what God meant. He established marriage, and He established it with one man and one woman, and said that a man is to cleave to his wife, and they are to become one. God established the family. That's the starting point. That's the place we have to go when you can look at all the various ideas that people come up with. And you find all of the social engineering and all of the ideas and the attitudes that people come along with. The point is that the family was started, was instituted, was established by God, and God designed the family unit. And He started with one man and one woman. And that was the basis of the human family that has developed. Now, back in the book of Malachi, chapter 2, we read a little further. And we begin to see a little bit of why the family was so important. Because if God established the family, He ordained and established the family, created it, designed it, why? What's the purpose of the family? Why is the family so important? Notice in the book of Malachi, chapter 2, in verse 11, God inspired Malachi to write in verse 11, Judah has dealt treacherously. It's dealt treacherously. Now, God began to indict the nation. Malachi was writing at the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. And Malachi indicted the nation because for the same things. If you want the background of it, you can read Ezra and Nehemiah. We find that there was a problem. In the beginning of chapter 2, he indicted the priesthood. They were to have kept knowledge. The people should have been able to seek the law at their mouth. When you go back and read Nehemiah, you realize the priesthood had gotten off the track and was setting a horrible example. They departed out of the way and caused many to stumble in verse 8. Then we get into the fact that the priesthood had broken their covenant, had violated God's law, and set a bad example for the people. We find that people in their dealings with one another dealt treacherously. The priesthood dealt treacherously. Now the people dealt treacherously. In verse 10, it talks about people having dealt treacherously, every man against his brother. Verse 11, Judah has dealt treacherously, and an abomination is committed in Israel and in Jerusalem. Judah has profaned the holiness of the eternal which he loved, and has married the daughter of a strange god. So here the nation had not been faithful to God, was involved in unfaithfulness. God takes note of that. He'll cut off the man that does this, the master and the scholar, out of the tabernacles of Jacob. So then he goes on in verse 13, this have you done again, covering the altar of the Lord with tears and weeping and crying. How did they do that? Verse 14, the Lord has been witness between you and the wife of your youth, against whom you have dealt treacherously. Yet is she your companion and the wife of your covenant. See, marriage involves a covenant. And here we find individuals who were indicted because they had dealt treacherously. They had been dishonest. They had betrayed trust. They had dealt treacherously against the wife of their youth. And God says, I am a witness. God is a solemn and silent witness of all covenants, of all agreements. When we speak and we give our word, we are doing so in the sight of God. And to violate our word, to turn away from a covenant that we have entered into, is a very serious matter. God brings out here in chapter 2 that the priesthood and the people had not lived up to their covenants, not in their relationship with Him, not in their relationship, in the social relationship of people with one another, and not in the relationship in the home and in the family. So here were those who were dealing treacherously against the wife of their youth. Did not He make one? Verse 15. God made one. These, they twain, shall be one flesh. He made one. Now, sort of a parenthetical statement is added in. Yet He had, speaking here of the man, when you get it in context, excellency of spirit, or was high-spirited, and said, wherefore one? Why just one? The answer is then given that He might seek, that God might seek a godly seed. Therefore take heed to your spirit, and let none deal treacherously against the wife of his youth. For the Eternal, the God of Israel, says that He hates putting away. One covers violence with his garment, says the Lord of hosts. Therefore take heed to your spirit. Control yourself. Don't deal treacherously. Here we find the reason why God is so, one of the reasons, there's more than one, but this is one very important reason why God is so concerned about the family, that He might seek a godly seed. God's desire is to see a generation that is brought up in a right way, that is taught and oriented toward the way of God and the truth of God, that He might seek a godly seed. The whole purpose of the family, one of the major purposes of the family, has to do with the transmission of values from one generation to the next. And when the family breaks down, the transmission of values breaks down. And then society breaks down. And we're seeing those consequences all around us. We're seeing them right here in our area of the world, and we certainly see them when we look at the greater society as well. Now, he talks about here. This is an interesting statement when he says that one covers violence with his garment. Now, this is an interesting phrase because the reference to covering with the garment had to do was a sort of a symbolic phrase relating to marriage, and you find that it represented. In fact, it's part of the Jewish wedding ceremony today, when the groom's cloak is spread there on the bride, is spread over the bride. You can read an allusion to it back in the book of Ruth, when Boaz covering her with that outer garment was taken as the equivalent of a proposal, and you can read even the analogy that God describes back in Ezekiel 16:8 when He talks, speaking of Israel, drawing the poetic description of His marriage to Israel. And He says, I spread my skirt over you, or my robe over you. Again, symbolic of marriage. So when it talks about one covers violence with his garment, it's really talking about very specifically violence that is perpetrated in the context of marriage. That here's a man who has promised to love and to respect and to take care of a woman, and in effect under the guise of marriage he has abused that and has perpetrated violence. One covers violence with his garment, says the Lord of hosts. Therefore take heed to your spirit, that you deal not treacherously. You have wearied the Eternal with your words. Yes, you say, wherein have we wearied him? When you say every one that does evil is good in the sight of the Lord, and he delights in them. Or where is the God of judgment? Oh, God says, I will send my messenger. Chapter 3, verse 1. He shall prepare the way before me, and the Lord whom you seek shall suddenly come to his temple, even the messenger of the covenant whom you delight in. He shall come, says the Lord of hosts, but who may abide the day of his coming? Who shall stand when he appears? For he's like refiner's fire and fuller's soap. Verse 5, I'll come near to you to judgment. And I will be a swift witness against the sorcerers and against the adulterers and against false swearers and against those that oppress the hireling in his wages, the widow and the fatherless, that turn aside the stranger from his right, and fear not me, says the Eternal of hosts. Now, we just got through reading back early on in the end of the announcement period back in 1 Peter 4:17. The time has come, the judgment must begin at the house of God. And if it first began at us, what shall be the end of them that obey not the gospel? Christ talks about that, inspired Malachi to write here in Malachi 3:5, I'll come near to you to judgment. There is a judgment, and there is a judgment and an accountability. And God's judgment always begins with his own people. Those, to him that knows to do good and does it not, to him it is sin. The more we know, the more that we understand, the more for which we are accountable. Now, God talks about the family. And we see that one of the main things that he says here, one of the reasons why did God establish the family? Why did God establish a permanent relationship as the basis of the family? Relationship between a man and a woman. That he might seek a godly seed. You see, that is a primary purpose of the family, involving the transmission of values, that he might seek a godly seed. Now, what values are we talking about? What is it that we're looking at, the transmission of values? What's to be transmitted? How's that to be done? Because God is after something. One generation, I think we understand, hopefully we do, that as parents, we cannot control the long-term choices that our children make. Because when they're young, we can control them. They live in our house, but as they get on up and they mature and they come to a point of adulthood, there is a point where they will make their own decisions and have the freedom to do it, because somebody lives in my house under my roof and eats my food, then I'm going to have some control over what goes on. But there comes a point, you see, when that doesn't that's temporary. That's not permanent. We as parents can't control the long-term decisions and choices that our children make, but we can be a very significant, a very great influence on those choices. We can influence those choices. And that is our responsibility, to seek to influence those choices in the right way. Choice doesn't mean, when we say that God gives us a choice, that's right, but he always made plain what the alternatives were, what the consequences were of that choice. And he told Israel of old, he said, I set before you a choice. I set before you life and death, good and evil. Choose life that you and your seed may live. God made plain what the choices were. He made plain what the consequences were. And he made plain what choice ought to be made. But they have choice. All choices aren't created equal. Some choices lead to good results and some to bad results. We can't control the long term. We may control a child as small, and we can control things. The younger they are, the more total control you have. A little baby you can control where he is because he can't get out of it. And finally, there comes the time when he's old enough that he can crawl out of the crib. And then you don't have quite as much control as you had when you could just stick him in there and know he was going to be there when you came back. As the older they get, the less control that you have, but there is an influence that can be there. And we can't take responsibility for all the choices they make, but we can take responsibility for seeking to influence those and guide those choices in a right and a constructive way. Now let's look a little bit. God says the family is important. Why? One, that he might seek a godly seed. Notice back here in Deuteronomy chapter 4. Let's look a little bit at the values to be transmitted. God told Israel of old and through Moses in Deuteronomy 4:1, therefore hearken, O Israel, unto the statutes and unto the judgments, which I teach you for to do them, that you may live and go in and possess the land which the Lord God of your fathers gives you. You don't add to the word that I command, and you don't diminish from it. He goes on that in verse 5, I've taught you statutes and judgments, even as the Lord my God commanded me, that you should do so in the land where you go to possess it. Keep therefore and do them. This is your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of the nations. He said on down in verse 9, take heed to yourself and keep your soul diligently, lest you forget the things which your eyes have seen, lest they depart from your heart all the days of your life, but teach them to your sons and your sons' sons. Specifically, especially, the day that you stood before the Eternal your God in Horeb, when the Lord said unto me, gather the people together, and I will make them hear my words, that they may learn to fear me all the days they live upon the earth, and they shall, that they may teach their children. You came near and stood under the mountain burned. In verse 12, the Lord spoke unto you out of the midst of the fire. You heard the voice of the words. Verse 13, he declared unto you his covenant, which he commanded you to perform, even 10 commandments, and he wrote them on 2 tables of stone. The Lord commanded me at that time to teach you statutes and judgments. Now, notice, what were they to do? They were to teach these things. He said, you shall teach them to your children. You shall teach them to your sons and your sons' sons. One of the major things that we find here, focused on the 10 commandments. It focused on the basic relationship with God. Turn on over a couple of pages. Chapter 5 recounts the 10 commandments. Chapter 6, verse 1, these are the commandments, the statutes, the judgments the Lord your God commanded to teach you, that you might do them in the land where you go to possess, that you might fear the Eternal your God, to keep all his statutes and his commandments. He told them in verse 4 that they were to hear God, and him only were they to hear, that they were to love, verse 5, the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. These words which I command you this day shall be in your heart, and you shall teach them diligently unto your children. Shall talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise up. Was it important that parents transmit values? You bet it was. You're to teach them diligently to your children, not casually, not lackadaisically. What were they to teach? The 2 things that are brought out right here. One in chapter 6 emphasizes one of the main things that we're to teach is that God comes first. We're to hear God first and foremost, him only. We're to love him with all our heart, with all our soul, with all our might. God comes first. And as he brings out in Deuteronomy 4, focus back on the giving of the 10 commandments. The great God that we serve and with whom we have entered into a relationship. To obey God, to keep his commandments. He says, you shall teach these things. Teach them diligently to your children. How do you do that? Well, you talk of them when you're sitting in the house, when you're walking by the way, lie down, rise up. Now, does that mean you just go around lecturing your kid all day? No. It's not what it's talking about. Number one, it's talking about the fact you're spending time. It presupposes you're spending time with your children, because you don't have a chance to do this if you're not spending time. You spend time sitting in the house. You spend time walking and doing things. You see them early in the morning, you see them late in the evening. It presupposes you're spending time. And it says when you're spending that time, take advantage of the time and the opportunities that come up to diligently teach and instruct them. All through life, everything they face provides opportunities of orienting them back to basic values. God has to come first. And I'll tell you, the way in which we present things makes a big difference. We can present things in a very positive way, focusing in on God and God's way and God's plan and God's purpose. Or we can undermine the effectiveness of that. You know, parents can teach their children in the sense of, in the way of explaining, well, look, God doesn't want us to do that, or He doesn't want us to act like that, or look like that, or do that, or whatever, or talk like that, or whatever it is. God doesn't want us to do that, and here's why. And those who have approached it that way have had far different results than those who have simply said, well, the church won't let us do so and so. Or, you probably get in trouble with the minister if you do this. Or I've known parents who have, that's the way they've approached it and sort of been puzzled as to why they didn't get quite the result somebody else got. Figured it just was sort of, like lightning strikes, didn't strike them. It's, well, some people are lucky and some aren't. There is a positive approach that we're told to take. We're to teach diligently. We're to emphasize that God has to come first. And we are to emphasize the importance of God's law, His revelation, the Ten Commandments. This is a very crucial approach. One of the major purposes of the family. Why did God establish and institute marriage? That He might seek a godly seed. God established a permanent relationship to exist, and He established a family unit based upon that. Animals reproduce, but they don't marry. Now, a mother animal may have great loyalty and be very protective of her young. He made the news recently, the mother cat that rescued her little kittens from the fire. Just a couple of days ago, my wife and I were walking, and we looked up, and here came a bird chasing a squirrel. And boy, she was telling that squirrel something. And the squirrel must have been up there next to her nest. And she was diving at him, and she was clucking at him the whole time. She was really giving it to him. And you almost wish you could have understood bird. She was obviously telling him just the way it was. And he wasn't getting far enough away to suit her, and she was coming back at him. And he kept getting further and further away. God has built within animals a certain protective instinct. But there is not a multi-generation connection. There's not a family established. A mother can be very protective of her young while they're young. They get on up grown and they have kittens or puppies or whatever. Well, there's no particular family connection that's there. And it's not the same thing. Now, God has established the family as a means of transmitting values that He might seek a godly seed. That proper values might be transmitted from one generation to the next. And that is a very crucial thing. And I think that we sometimes don't recognize the impact that some of that's happening. I'll tell you one thing. This is an article from the New York Times entitled, "Let's Hope that California is no longer the American Trendsetter." This is dated March the 27th as well. It says the growth industry in California is prisons. Just 15 years ago, the state spent 6 times as much on higher education as on prisons. Last year, the prison budget was larger, and the disparity is going to grow. It now takes 10% of the state budget to operate the prisons. According to a study by the Rand Corporation, it'll be 18% 6 years from now. So, prison guards who have a powerful union earn more than public school teachers. So anyway, you could go through. There was another article that this is John Leo, who is a syndicated columnist. This quoted from a column back in January. Says the Murphy-Brown argument is now over, and Dan Quayle has won. An avalanche of evidence shows that single-parent kids are way more vulnerable than two-parent kids to all sorts of damage in all races and at all income levels under all kinds of conditions. The mountain of evidence is just too high to keep arguing that different family forms are equally valuable, or that, as Barbara Whitehead wrote, and this was an article in the Atlantic Monthly. She wrote recently in an article in the Atlantic Monthly that she's struck by the number of angry, emotionally scarred children of divorce she runs into. A well-known economist at a Washington conference on reframing family values said that a woman's right to have a baby without a father is what feminism is all about. Well, as the article goes on, it's impossible to overestimate how deeply our intellectual and cultural elite is implicated in the continuing decline of the American nuclear family. Maggie Gallagher, in a book, The Abolition of Marriage, says that marriage has been ruthlessly dismantled piece by piece under the influence of those who believe that the abolition of marriage was necessary to advance human freedom. Demoted to one lifestyle among many. Just another way of doing things. Marriage is no longer viewed by these cultural elite as a crucial social institution, but as a purely private and temporary act. God lays out the problem and the solution there in Malachi chapter 2. He talks about dealing treacherously, undermining the sanctity of marriage. God established His laws to guard and protect. Morality is the guardian of the sanctity of marriage. Marriage is the basis of the family, and morality is a guardian of the sanctity of that marriage. And when morality is undermined, when that is thrown away, then the whole thing suffers. And there is a breakdown in the ability of right values to be transmitted to a new generation. So we find that one of the major reasons for the family centered on the transmission of values. There's God's law, God's way, God's approach to life. That's part of why the family was established. The family was also established on the human level because it pictures something on a divine level. It is a God-plane relationship. We read in Ephesians about the relationship of Christ and the church. That the relationship of husbands and wives is intended to mirror a relationship that exists on the spiritual level of Christ and the church. Our relationship to God is described as the relationship of children to our Father in heaven. That's what we're told there. And when Christ taught the disciples to pray, what did He teach them to say? He told them to address God, our Father who's in heaven. So the relationship that exists on the divine level is a family relationship that we can ultimately be born into God's family, to share life with Him as His children. Jesus Christ is our elder brother. God is our Father. Our relationship with one another is as brothers and sisters. The relationship of Christ and the church is a husband-wife relationship. God established human family relationships as a picture of something. He didn't do that on the animal level. God didn't intend for people to act like a bunch of alley cats or a pack of dogs. The world teaches evolution. Well, Evolution is the idea that man is evolving. He's started with the lower animals and he's working his way up. I think when you look around in society, what you see more is evolution in reverse. Instead of animals turning into people, what you find is people acting like animals. You find things headed the wrong direction. When you look at what's going on in society, you find increasingly that is the case. Family relationship is a God-plane relationship. That's what it's designed to be, intended to picture, to prepare us for a relationship. It's to model something. Now, sadly, in a lot of cases, that's not what happens. We're going to look a little bit later at some of that. But, there are times when people are damaged in their ability to relate to God and to relate to other people, to relate on a spiritual level because of what they have experienced. Their families. Another thing in terms of the family, to shape the next generation, to picture a God-plane relationship, the family was also given as a means by which our sights are raised from just ourselves. You see, a means of going beyond just a selfish, self-centered, self-focused approach. It's normal and natural. We all start out being primarily concerned and totally focused on ourselves. If we're hungry, we're ready to eat. A little baby, if he's hungry, he's ready to eat. If he's uncomfortable, he wants to be tended to. His mind revolves around himself. That's what he thinks about. That's natural and that's normal. Little babies are cute and we can put up with that, but tell you, by the time somebody gets 30, 40, 50 and they're still functioning on that level, it has long since ceased to be cute. And unfortunately, there are those who are still acting that way. Little baby doesn't lay there and think, boy, mom's had a rough day and I think I'll just let her sleep. I'll just tough out this old dirty diaper for another 2 or 3 hours. Well, that's not generally, I think I can live for another few hours without anything to drink, so I'll just sort of lay here and let her sleep. Well, that's not you see, we start out and we're naturally focused on our needs and our wants. But the family is a means by which we learn to take a bigger view. And we learn how to relate with others. And, when you get married, you have to then recognize how selfish and self-centered you naturally and normally are. And in order to live in peace and in harmony with someone else, you have to learn to give. You have to learn to put up with a little inconvenience. You have to learn some things that really sort of make us all realize how selfish we are. And it's a means of learning to raise our sights from just where we are. And part of the problems, even economic problems that we're having, the deterioration of the environment, all these things, it comes back to the same thing, because you see, the family is the basis by which you recognize that you're a link in a long chain. It stretches all the way back to Adam and all the way forward on into the millennium. You're a link in a chain. You're connected to those who come before and those who come after. A farmer who realizes that he's not just farming until he can retire. He's not just farming to get what he can get, make all the profit he can get, and then do something else. That he is doing something that and taking care of land. He's making a living with land that will one day belong to his children and his grandchildren, and that not only is he going to have to make a living off of it, but others that come after him for generations will have to do so. It makes a difference in the way you deal with things and what you do. Businesses that are built up and the idea that somebody's going to spin everything off and go their own way, and they're not concerned about what comes afterward. They're not thinking long term, they're thinking short term. There's a big difference between a mindset that thinks in terms of the future, in terms of generations to come, and a mindset that is focused simply on the here and now, on what I can get right here, right now. The basis of, or the family is a major way in which human beings learn, was established as giving us a perspective that stretches beyond our own selves, that stretches back and stretches forward. And there are long-term consequences that come when that's not done. We're reaping many of those in our country. We reap it with the ecology, and we reap it with the economy. Of course, the two are tied together. There are a lot of very short-term decisions that people have made because they're really not thinking in a family context. They're not looking at something that will extend on beyond themselves for generations to come. Makes a big difference in the approach. God intended that the family would be a means of transmitting godly values to the next generation. It would be a means of helping us to understand the God-plane relationship. It would be a means by which we would be able to connect and to think in terms that reach far beyond ourselves and our own selfish here and now interests, that use every sort of tactic to undermine the family. One, of course, involves the breakdown of morality. And that has carried through. We see it evidenced in our television, our entertainment. If you want to contrast sometime, and I'm sure various ones of you have done this, look at an old rerun on television sometime. One of the old television shows, reach back 30, 35 years, one of the old I Love Lucy shows or something. And you take a contemporary program, contemporary sitcom, and there is such a total contrast in what is simply taken for granted as normal. You find out that society's agreement on what's normal has drastically changed in the last few decades, and that one of the things that has changed is the attitude toward morality. Now, there have been some studies that have been done to just simply go through and count the number of times that sex is mentioned or referred to or pictured in terms of what's called prime time. And literally, if you're counting all the programs during the prime time on a particular evening, you're looking at hundreds of times. Whether it's in a joke, whether it's in something that is said, whether it's in something that is shown. And in virtually all of these contexts, there are some exceptions, but the overwhelming majority, I think if I remember right, the figure was somewhere around 85-90%, that the context of what is said and what is shown and what is done is something that focuses approvingly on adultery, on fornication, on homosexuality, on some sort of sexual immorality. It's presented as normal, as natural, as though there's somehow something wrong with somebody that doesn't agree with that or doesn't promote that value. Morality is the guardian it guards the sanctity of the family. It sets apart a relationship. It guards the sanctity of marriage, and marriage is at the heart of the family. When morality breaks down, a relationship something that sets apart this relationship is different from any other. Here's a relationship that two people share with one another that they don't share with anyone else. Something that gives specialness and sanctity, that sets apart marriage and sets apart the family unit based upon marriage. What do you have? You've got the kind of breakdown that we find in our nation. God told ancient Israel way back in Leviticus chapter 18. Leviticus 18 verse 1, the Lord spoke unto Moses, and he said, Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, I am the eternal your God. After the doings of the land of Egypt wherein you dwelt, you shall not do. After the doings of the land of Canaan where I bring you, you shall not do, neither shall you walk in their ordinances. Then, what does he do? In verse 6, he begins to focus on morality and particularly goes into great detail dealing with the sins of incest. So that was part of what contaminated Egypt. It was characteristic of the Canaanites. God goes through and focuses in on the problems. He deals with the matter of incest. He deals with homosexuality. He deals with various perversions. Talks about adultery. You know, you're not to lie carnally with your neighbor's wife. And then he said in verse 24, defile not you yourselves in any of these things, for in all these the nations are defiled, which I cast out before you, and the land is defiled, therefore do I visit the iniquity thereof upon it, and the land vomits out her inhabitants. You shall keep my statutes and my judgments, and not commit any of these abominations, neither any of your own nation or any stranger that sojourns among you. For all these abominations have the men of the land done which were before you, and the land is defiled. The land is defiled. We find that morality was undermined. It was undermined. Trust was betrayed in the home. And it discusses it in the context of everything from, all the various ramifications, all the things that people come up with. There is a betrayal of trust. There is a destruction of a relationship that should exist in a family. So we find that whether it reflects itself in any of these ways, in any of these perversions, Satan has encouraged an atmosphere, has fostered an atmosphere of casual sex that really treats lightly and casually all these things. And so we find that more and more the families of this country are falling apart. An attitude set to destroy the role of the family. And there are other things. Blurring the distinction of gender roles. Satan has permitted and has promoted, fostered an atmosphere in this land that accepts the blur of any distinction between masculine and feminine, male and female. Reflects itself in all sorts of ways. God established, He which made them at the beginning, made them male and female. And God intended that is to be appreciated and valued. God, you go through and there's restrictions and comments in the law, everything involving appearance in terms of hairstyle and clothing style to all sorts of things that we are to focus on, to highlight, to appreciate, to value our identity as male and female. And that what goes against that is at best described as a shame, and at worst described as an abomination that results in a loss of identity. And what we're finding, our society wants to promote the obliteration of distinctions between male and female. Now, when you do away with the distinctions between male and female, then you undermine the ability of the family to function, of husbands and wives to relate to one another and to function in a right and healthy way. You undermine people's ability to really derive a satisfaction in a right way, because we're going to be happiest, most fulfilled when we are what God designed us to be. When we are seeking to become what God intended us to be. So we find a breakdown of gender distinction. We find easy, permissive immorality. We find a focus of getting people to focus simply on themselves. It's inconvenient. It's inconvenient to take care of the very young, inconvenient to take care of the very old. That's what a lot of people find, so they don't want to be bothered. They don't want to be bothered. And they find that there comes a time when nobody wants to be bothered with them anyway. We live in a society that places maximum emphasis on people selfishly, self-centeredly pursuing their own thing. They want what they want. They don't want to be inconvenienced. And we see these kinds of attitudes. They want the experts to do it. They want somebody else to take care of it. And so we see the consequence in terms of who's to rear the children, who's to teach them and transmit those values. No, the attitude that's happening in this country is not that the government is primarily coming around and taking the children from the parents to go and rear them and teach them. It's that the parents are increasingly beating down the door, asking the government, here, you set up a program, you take them, you teach them. I'm too busy. I've got this, I've got that. You do it. You fund it. You set it up. You organize it. You see, the problem is that people abdicate responsibility. They fail to really view, to appreciate the value of what God designed and what God intended. So every sort of craziness imaginable, and then people operate under the assumption that one ideal, one choice is as good as another. Sort of like the idea that it was stated, we read a little bit earlier, that a woman's right to have a baby without a father is what feminism is all about. Oh, really? Well, that's pretty crazy. In a society that can't tell that that's crazy, shows how crazy it is. That you've got just absolute insanity. And the thing is, there are consequences that are coming. We have it all over the nation, all over the society. We see the results. Now, what can we do? Right now, we can't solve the problems of the whole society and the whole culture. The time is going to come when the God of heaven is going to set up a kingdom that will never be removed. When we will be able to carry out God's ways. What we can do is to focus in our own lives, in terms of our own commitments. We can learn the lessons we need to learn here and now, so that we can be a part of transmitting the solution in the future. There are benefits that we can reap in our own lives right here and right now, and there are long-term benefits because we have the opportunity of being a part of what's going to really solve the problem. Ultimately, relationships depend greatly on the commitment that lies behind those relationships. Our first commitment has got to be to God. And if we're committed to God and to His laws and to His ways, if we're committed to God's way of life, we're committed to seeking God. That's what we're told there in Deuteronomy. We read it, Deuteronomy 4, Deuteronomy 6. Then what's important to God and what God lays importance on will be important to us. And God's laws give a stability to our life and to our choices that we will make. When we understand that God approves of this or disapproves of that, it will be what gives focus, what gives sharpness to our approach and our focus. Now, when we're looking at personal relationships, in terms of the family, there's got to be, first and foremost, there's got to be a commitment to marriage. If there's not a commitment, then nothing will last, nothing will endure. God talked about in Malachi that He indicted the nation. He talked about the wife of your youth against whom you've dealt treacherously, and in one case refers to her, He says, the wife of your covenant. You see, from a biblical standpoint, marriage is viewed as a covenant. When we have the marriage ceremony in the church, we ask the couple, do you agree here, do you promise to accept the sacred marriage covenant according to the divinely ordained laws of God. Sacred marriage covenant. A covenant is a solemn agreement. It's made before witnesses. It's made in the presence of God. Here are two people at a wedding. A wedding is a celebration. The family, the friends have come together to celebrate the public commitment. The two people who've come to love one another make. They're making it in the eyes of their family and friends, the people that are closest to them. Most importantly, they're making it before God. They're entering into a covenant with one another, and God is the witness to that covenant. See, that's the basis of commitment to marriage. God says, "Thou shalt not commit adultery." That's there to protect and preserve the family, to establish the sanctity of the relationship of marriage that is then the basis of the family, the nuclear family, and the extended family. If there's not a commitment to marriage, then there's not going to be permanence. And that will undermine stability, and it will undermine the ability to transmit those stable, solid values, godly values, from one generation to the next. You know, if we're really committed in that way, then we go to God to define our role. We go to God's Word to define what is it that God intends us to be. What does God intend for a husband to be? What does He intend for a wife to be? We read it, and with God's help, we seek to understand it by applying it, by putting it into practice in our lives. You can read, God says, "Husbands, love your wives. Christ loved the church. Wives, submit yourselves to your husbands." We've read those verses. You can read them and you can rattle them off. But if we're committed to marriage, we not simply go through and read what it says. Then comes the part of learning, how do I apply that in, day out circumstances? We seek to exercise our abilities by applying and practicing, by making choices on a day-by-day basis of using what God says, using God's definitions as a means of how do we put it into practice. We're committed to a relationship. We're committed to marriage on God's terms. Not simply on our terms or on society's terms, or until something better comes along, quote unquote. Well, that's the way a lot of people say there's the depths of their commitment. They're committed to this until they find that. And they sort of go through life that way. Well, commitment is based on the acceptance that God is the one who defines things, and we accept His definitions, and there is a commitment to become what God wants us to be. That will show up in terms of marriage, commitment to marriage. What about commitment to our... That's the starting point, you see, in a family. You've got to be committed to the marriage. What about commitment to the children? See, that's... that involves is back in Ephesians 6. Ephesians chapter 6. Verse 1 says, "Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and your mother, which is the first commandment with promise, that it may be well with you, that you may live long on the earth. Your fathers, provoke not your children to wrath, but bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord." Now notice what we find right here. We find two different aspects. You see, really, marriage is, or the family, is based on a commitment to marriage, a commitment of parents to children, and a commitment of children to parents. Because the family tells us and emphasizes to us that we are links in a chain that stretch backward and that stretch forward. That we are a link in a chain. We're part of something that is bigger than ourselves, that reaches beyond us, that has implications not just for me right now, right here. It involves commitment. Now, here we're told in terms of commitment to the children, it says, "Fathers, don't provoke your children to wrath." Don't just needle them and ride them and humiliate them. But do bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. This word nurture is a word that elsewhere in the New Testament is rendered discipline, nurture, instruction, chastening. The word admonition is rendered admonition or warning. There are two aspects. One has to do with discipline and instruction. Discipline involves making disciples. Words come from the same. We are, in that sense, to be making disciples out of our children. Maybe we've never thought of it quite that way. But there are a variety of things to help them develop certain patterns and a certain approach. It involves active teaching, because it involves the transmission of values, a commitment to bringing them up in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord, to orienting them in a right way. It involves time that is spent. It involves teaching that is given. And that has to start by our example, because the most powerful teaching we will give is through our example. Now, that's not all the teaching. There has to be explanation. There has to be positive instruction. There have to be restrictions and guidelines that are set. If you don't set guidelines, it's just like you plant a young tree, and you set some guidelines out there to keep it straight, because if you don't, the forces of nature will push it one way, push it another. It's got to have roots that go down. It's got to grow and become a little less pliable, a little less able to be twisted, turned, and distorted. We have a responsibility that involves teaching values, all sorts of things. Values of morality, values of respect. Honor your father and your mother. That's the first commandment with promise. The first commandment that a child is capable of understanding is honor your father and your mother. Long before they can understand what it means not to have another God before the true God. Or don't commit adultery. Or don't bow down to idols. Explain that one to a 3-year-old. Now, a young child may learn to repeat the words, but they don't have a very deep grasp of that. But the first commandment they can really relate to in a personal way is honor your father and your mother. Learning to respond to their parents, learning to obey their parents, learning to show respect. That's the first commandment that a child is capable of learning, and it's the basis, it's the first relationship they establish, and it's the basis of other relationships that will come. If they don't learn respect in the home, why would we expect them to have it when they go to school? If they don't learn to respect their parents, they're not going to respect the teachers. They're not going to respect authority figures in general. The basis, but it says, it may be well with you that you may live long on the earth, or actually this is quoted from in the Old Testament, you may live long on the land which the Lord your God gives you. Live long on the land. In other words, a society that will be stable and permanent and that will endure for generations and centuries, where the family is strong. A society will have strength and stability and will have a basis of remaining on that land, remaining in that area, remaining and preserving its freedom and its identity as a nation for generations and centuries. But when there's no longer honor in the home, when the parents aren't honored, you can bet that respect in society will have broken down. A society can't function without respect. Respect becomes a glue that holds society together. You take away respect and all you have is the law of the jungle. Big animals eat the little animals. And so you have people who are confronted with this sort of thing. If those who become the most vulnerable become a prey. When respect breaks down, that respect is what keeps people from doing something simply because they have the power and the strength to do it. You treat people in certain ways. not because they have a bigger gun than you have, or because they're 6 inches taller or 50 pounds heavier, but on a basis of respect. You see, God tells us to respect those who are older. Respect is the basis by which society can function. When respect breaks down, the whole bonds that tie a community together dissolve. And there's no longer a basis for trust, for respect. Society becomes increasingly violent. And that's what we're seeing. And we're seeing it show up with the younger generation, but there is a reason. This is a very crucial thing. Honor your father and your mother. It's the first commandment with promise. It holds out a promise. If you really do that, it will lead to something that is good and positive and stable. There has to be a commitment to marriage, a commitment to children, a commitment of children to parents. That includes those of us as adult children to honor our parents. To show that sort of respect, because if we want to reap that, we must set that example. We teach by our example as well as by our instruction. If you say one thing by example and another thing by instruction, then you're undermining yourself. And yet when you show it and when you explain it, and what you explain and what you show are the same thing, then you're reinforcing a way of life, a way of living. The family is a very important part of society. It is the basis from which society develops. The marriage is the basis of the family. The family is the basis of the community. The nation is a collection of its families and its communities. These connections, these relationships go back to the family. God ordained and instituted the family. And if we're not committed in the context of if a husband and wife aren't committed to one another and to their marriage, if they're not committed to their children, if children, and that includes all of us, we're all children of someone, there needs to be a commitment to our parents, setting that example of honoring our parents. So we have a basis of connection that reaches backward, that reaches forward, that identifies us as part of something far bigger and grander and greater than merely ourselves. We live increasingly in a society of selfish individuals. God intends that we have a bigger and a broader view. He established the family for the purpose of seeking a godly seed. That godly values would be transmitted. Now, none of us have choices about our past. You can't go back and choose. We are the products of what we were, be that good or bad. None of us have choices about our past, but we do have choices about today. And we have choices that will affect tomorrow. We can learn from the past, and we can apply God's ways today. We can focus on basic values. We can focus on commitment to those values. God tells us through the pen of the psalmist in Psalm 127, verse 1, "Except the Lord shall build the house, they labor in vain to build it." Ultimately, God has to be the center. We're going to build a godly home. Then we must allow God to build it. "Except the Lord shall build the house, the weary builders toil in vain," as we sing it in the song. It's vain for you to rise up early, to sit up late, to the bread of anxious care partake, again, as we sing it in the version we have in the hymnal. We don't have to sit around and worrying and stay up all night worrying and anxious and and being fretful and wringing our hands. It's a matter of putting it in God's hands and of really looking to Him. God gives to His beloved sleep. For children are a heritage of the Lord, and the fruit of the womb is His reward. Well, that's not the way our society tends to view children. That's what God says. He says they're a heritage of the Lord. That's a wonderful thing that God has given. That's His reward. Continuing on in Psalm 128, verse 1, Blessed is everyone that fears the Eternal, that walks in His ways. You shall eat the labor of your hands, happy shall you be. It'll be well with you. Your wife shall be as a fruitful vine by the sides of your house, your children like olive plants round about your table. Well, that's what God says our children are to be like olive plants. Not like weeds or briars or thistles. Compares them to something that was very valuable, something that was important. The point is, God intends that children are to be a blessing. And He gives us the basis by which we can be a right and a good and a healthy and a positive influence. We have to start where we can start. And the starting point is a commitment to God and a commitment to God's way of life. A commitment to God's laws. And a commitment to becoming what God has designed us to be. And as we appreciate and value what God has established, then we have a basis of doing the things we need to do to go forward and to be able to transmit and to convey some of those things to a generation that is yet coming. And when we do that, we will really be able to grasp and to understand what's meant when God tells us that children are a heritage of the Lord and the fruit of the womb is His reward.